the status quo. Shannon grew up on a grain farm near Rollo, Saskatchewan. She has a master's in plant sciences from the University of Saskatchewan and 19 years of experience in crops extension. Shannon is passionate about assisting producers faced with challenges and the agriculture industry as a whole. In her role of crops extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, she provides practical, science-based information and annual crop variety selection, integrated pest management, including disease and herbicide-resistant weed concerns, and crop production and rotation. So please welcome Shannon Chant.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. I just wanted to check, can you see my screen? And hear me as well? Awesome. All right, we'll get rolling. Thank you very much for the introduction and having me speak this afternoon. So what I'm going to speak about this afternoon is kind of the status quo for Saskatchewan and Western Canada for herbicide resistance, and kind of what's the difference between tolerance and resistance, how to tell if there's herbicide resistance in fields, a way to confirm that resistance, and management of herbicide-resistant weeds. So this is the latest herbicide-resistant weed survey back in 2019 to 2023. They do each year separately. So for Alberta would be 1 year, Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba. A lot of the information I have today is from Charles Geddes, so I really appreciate him allowing me to use his information. So herbicide-resistant weeds are costing prairie farmers about $658 million annually. 70% of fields had herbicide-resistant weeds, and of that total, if you're going to put it all together, that's 50% field coverage. In Canada, there are 87 weeds that have resistance, and about 2 new ones per year on average. So that's kind of where we're at. And 70% of fields in Western Canada had uncontrolled herbicide-resistant weeds when the survey took place. So from the data they collected, the top 5 broadleaf weeds, number 1 kochia. I just have the groups behind the weeds, what they're resistant to. So there's kochia that's resistant to group 2, 4, 9, and more recently group 14. And some populations are resistant to a combination of these. We basically assume all kochia is resistant to group 2. We actually took all of the group 2 listings out of the Guide to Crop Protection for kochia a few years ago. For lamb's quarters, there's also group 2 resistance. Wild buckwheat, there's group 2 in Western Canada, but not in Saskatchewan. That's been confirmed. Canada thistle doesn't have herbicide resistance yet. That's been confirmed. And then there's also spiny sow thistle, which is a group 2. Group 2 resistant. Of the grass weeds, the top one was wild oats, resistance to 4 groups, so 1, 2, 14, 15. Green foxtails, group 2 and 3. Barnyard grass, group 2, so that's not confirmed in Saskatchewan. Similar for foxtail barley, resistance to group 1. And yellow foxtail to group 2. Herbicide resistant for kochia. This is a study that was done recently for TPO inhibitors, so that is group 14, just showing where they are kind of in the province. So that one's kind of increasing. So again, group 2 and group 9, there's widespread resistance. You can assume resistance to these herbicides. For group 4, about 45% is dicamba resistant and 44% is fluroxypyr resistant for Alberta. And there has been group 14 resistance identified in different areas to carbendazole and cyclofenicil. The first group 14 resistance was found in West Central Saskatchewan. So just so you can kind of see, I don't know if it's spread into different areas or it was already there, but it is in Western Canada. And there are biotypes or populations of kochia that are resistant to group 2, 4, and 9. And group 9 is glyphosate. So if we're looking at Saskatchewan only, there's 25 weed species in Saskatchewan. Group 2 herbicides are kind of the highest risk. which just makes sense for that. They have the highest number of herbicide resistance. And this is as of early 2025. So if you're looking at herbicide groups and resistance in Saskatchewan, you can cross out these products is where there is resistance in a type of weed population in the province. If you're looking at Western Canada, there's another 3 that there's weeds that have herbicide resistance. So right now, we currently in Western Canada have more resistance to groups than we do have groups without resistance. So that's kind of where we're at. Charles Geddes and his group put together the Prairie Weed Monitoring Network. So this is something similar to the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. So you can go look at some of the information there. So under this, they're looking at the mapping of weeds, herbicide resistance survey, and the modeling for herbicide resistant risk. So that is the network that started, and it will be going till 2028. So that's kind of where we're at. I feel like I'm the doom and gloom usually, so we'll get into what we can do about it too, so it's not all bad. So again, this survey was in Western Canada. If you look at where kind of Saskatchewan is, it's approximately 72, 70 in there. And again, it's a fairly significant cost to all of these weeds, above what it would be without herbicide resistance. So if you look at Saskatchewan, from the last surveys, it goes up about 20 to 30% each time. So right now, if we're kind of here in the mid 70s, or what's the next one gonna be if we don't do anything or we don't change our management? And this is the graph. I just added the line in here. A couple, Manitoba seems to be kind of plateauing off maybe a bit. Just Alberta as well. We're kind of going up in a straight line. So again, my kind of concern is, if we're not doing anything else, where is that going to go to? The star on the bottom here is when I started talking about herbicide-resistant weeds and herbicide resistance in 2012. So it's not a new issue, but there is a lot of new resistance. And again, how much could this cost go up if we're just looking at chemical control as well? And I'm not saying don't use herbicides. Herbicides are a very, very effective tool, but I'm saying use them along with other things as well. So looking at what's the difference between resistance and tolerance. So tolerance is the inherited ability of a species to survive and reproduce, after herbicide treatment. So this is something that's normally happened. Herbicide resistance is when you have a plant to survive and also reproduce following exposure to a herbicide that's normally deadly to the wild type. What this means is the herbicide worked up until a point and then it didn't work. So unfortunately, this is not something that can be changed. Once that population is resistant to that herbicide, that's kind of where it is. You can't go backwards, unfortunately. So normally in a plant, what happens is there's 2 components that come together. We'll say for this example, it produces an amino acid. So when you have a normal plant functioning, that enzyme or the herbicide will combine to that enzyme, and then you prevent that amino acid being produced, which is some of what kills the plant. And then you're missing that amino acid, so the plant can't grow normally. In some cases as well, you have one of the components that builds up, and that building up within the plant can mean that that product is toxic to the plant as well. So if you look at target site resistance, this one's more common than non-target site resistance, and it's easy to identify with the genetic test. So the types are usually genetic mutation of the target enzyme or overexpression of the target enzyme, and this is what causes glyphosate resistance in kochia. So again, sorry, going back one, if you look at this one, this is kind of where normally that herbicide would bind and cause the changes in plant development. But if you have a genetic mutation of that enzyme or that binding site, that herbicide then can't go in. So the components that were going to come together can still come together and make that amino acid. So the plant still functions as it's supposed to, and the herbicide will break down within that plant. And this is just showing overexpression of the target enzyme, so a bit of a different mechanism. So in this case, you have a herbicide that's binding, but you also have extra sites that are available, so extra copies of those sites. So the plant can still continue developing because it still can have those components being made into that amino acid or that product, even with the herbicide being bound. So non-target site resistance, this is less common than target site resistance. So this can be decreased absorption, translocation, or metabolism. And they believe metabolism is what causes resistance in group 2. Group 2 resistant wild oats. So you're looking at decreased absorption. Say this is your sprayer, this is your drops going in. It kind of prevents those from going within the plant. So something's keeping it out. Then reduce translocation. Say the herbicide gets into the leaf and into the plant, but it doesn't get moved to where it would have action. To where it would have action. Increased metabolism would be the herbicide gets broken down faster than it can have an impact on that plant. And then there's also compartmentalization. So a vacuole is just kind of like an air pocket. Within the plant, the herbicide goes in there and it kind of can put it in there and then kind of get rid of it without it being active. So how can you tell if there's a sprayer miss or if there's herbicide resistance in the field? For a sprayer miss, you'll have a geometric pattern that has kind of sharp defined edges, straight boundaries, and parallel lines. So with your sprayer, or if it's a couple passes, it'll be, a double width. It'll kind of make sense compared to where you sprayed. And there'll also be multiple species in that area. So this is a field with some canola seedlings. This here is the strip. So there's a few different weed species in there. So there's cleavers, flaxweed, kochia, stinkweed, and wild buckwheat. So those are all surviving within that row, but weeds controlled for the rest of the field. So herbicide, herbicide resistance does not have those sharp lines. The boundaries are really not defined as well, and it may show a general pattern, like where the combine was, or if something was dropped by a waterway, those seeds can move within the water and kind of get put somewhere else. And if you suspect that some of the weeds of one species are resistant, you should also have herbicide injury causing plant death on other plant species nearby. Sorry. So in this case, pick kochia. Say there's a line of kochia because it'll usually tumble with the wind. You can almost see a line sometimes of plants that survive. But there can be cases where one kochia died and the kochia right beside it survived. And in this case, two other weeds survived as well. But it's not unusual to find both because there'll be some populations within the field that are herbicide tolerant and some that aren't, unless you're looking at group 2 or group 9, then you can just assume that the kochia is resistant without getting it confirmed. So if you're looking at herbicide resistant testing, again, if you're in doubt, send a sample to a recognized lab. For Saskatchewan, we have our crop protection lab in Regina. So this is what the form looks like. I'll just go through a couple spots. If you suspect you have resistance, don't wait for confirmation. We take in samples usually till about January 15th. But a lot of those samples to see if there's resistance have to be grown out. So you have to get seeds to germinate, and then you have to get plants, and then have plants be big enough to get sprayed in a spray chamber. And then sometimes that's repeated as well. So because of the number of samples and how much work that is happening, there is being done between January and June. So unfortunately, we can't provide test results necessarily prior to seeding. And the method used for testing is intended to determine resistance to a herbicide group with a common mode of action and not to individual herbicides. So as you can see here for the group ones, there are a few different subcategories for group ones and for group twos. But for other herbicide groups over here, like 3, 15, or 9, it's just a herbicide group. Each sample, we need at least 2,000 dry mature seeds per test. No stems if possible. As clean as you can make the seeds, the better, because then it takes less time to kind of get those ready. No glyphosate applied to the weeds. Similar for crops, if you sprayed glyphosate on something and then it's gone to seed, there'll be reduced germination of those seeds because of the glyphosate, and the same thing happens for the weeds. And a completed form. The lab won't start processing until there's a completed form, even for samples, like if I sent something in as well. So they need that completed form to go with the sample to get going. And for some reason, if there's not enough seed, they ask that you specify a priority for testing. If you don't have that and there isn't enough seed, the lab will just kind of go with um, what subgroups tested or what's tested with that without knowing what you would like. Within the province, this is a $125 test for Saskatchewan residents and a $200 test for non-Saskatchewan residents. So there is a bit of a difference there for being in Saskatchewan. If for some reason there is a weed and suspected herbicide application that's completely new that hasn't been found in Western Canada, we do have an agreement with Ag Canada to send that weed to them, and they can go and look at the testing for that specific one. But if it's something, say you're looking at wild oats for a group 1 subgroup, that would be done in the lab in Regina. So looking at management for herbicide-resistant weeds, and honestly, this works for non-resistant weeds as well. This is good for kind of any weed issue. So if you're looking at chemical-based weed management here on the left, and kind of focusing on herbicides, you have a fairly big, you're relying mostly on chemical, and you just have some cultural and some physical going on for control as well. But if you compare that to integrated weed management, you can have chemical, physical, cultural, and biological weed management. So I'm sure people have heard of, big hammer versus little hammers for this. So if you lose your big hammer in your chemical-based management system, it's not going to be going that great for you if you're just relying on that chemical you have resistance to. Or if you look at an integrated one, if you take out the herbicide for mixtures or for rotation, even in some cases, you're kind of don't have that one hammer. But there's still a lot of other things going on that are helping control those weeds. So for chemical, we're going to talk a little bit about allelopathy and a little bit about herbicide layering. So herbicide layering is using multiple active ingredients and herbicide groups to control the same weed in the same field in the same year. You can also talk about applications in the fall as well. There's some more application in the fall for, especially for kochia, in with different crops. So this is kind of can be considered within that layer, and not necessarily in the same tank load. So if you can do something and spread it out through the season, kind of pre-seed, in crop if possible, maybe in the fall, depending on the weed. You can also provide improved weed control and return on investment, even if you don't have resistance. This is helping kind of you get a better control of that weed, regardless of resistance or not resistance. And in some cases, for example, if there's group 2 resistance in some weed populations, you're addressing several weeds, each prone to that resistance at one time. So for allelopathy, that's the ability of the residue or secretions of one plant to suppress the growth of another plant. The studies have found that green manuring residues of rye, sweet clover, and Sudan grass can suppress weeds the following year. With green manuring, you are losing kind of that production for that field for that year. But if you look at it compared to, what is that going to cost if you aren't getting control of that weed problem, or there is a resistance problem, you have to go and apply more expensive products. So this is a look at allelopathy for sweet clover. For dandelion, you look at without the sweet clover versus the sweet clover is a fairly significant difference just because of that one production practice. As well, on flickweed on the right, even for all different types, this is a bit of a study that was a bit older, so there's also cultivation in there as well. But with kind of everything, the sweet clover increased the, or sorry, decreased the weed density or the plants per square meter to increase the control of those weeds or better management. And this one is on the density of kochia the following spring. With sweet clover, they're fairly low, so there may have been something else going on there as well, I would think, but still definitely helping control that weed. So for physical, we'll go into tillage and then harvest weed seed control. There are a lot of other things that are also possible. For electrocution, I have heard of stuff that kind of contacts the weed and then electrocutes it, but it might be a little bit risky, especially in my area where it's pretty dry. So you could look at, mowing, clipping, a few different options. So there was a study done by Steve Shirtliff looking at rotary hose. Preceding tillage is also a possibility. In some cases, you might be able to get those weeds to germinate and then control them with seeding. And you can use that to control some cool season weeds like wild oats. Or post-seeding tillage, this would have to be done where you have deep-seeded crops like the pulses, and where those cotyledons stay with the seed. For example, for like canola or something like that, as soon as the seedling's growing, that growing point is in between the cotyledons. So that wouldn't be a very good option there, especially if the plants were just coming out of the ground. So this is some work done at the U of S. So if you look at the top, there's before rotary hoe, before harrows, or before intense tillage. And this is for lentils. So there's a fairly big difference before and after, and definitely some good weed control. The weeds with the rotary hoe, since those roots are exposed, they usually will kind of just dry up and blow away because they've been pulled out of the ground. And then that's just kind of looking at it as more of a graph. So in this case, don't know if intense tillage would be a great option unless there's something that was a fairly bad weed problem. But if you had a rotary hoe and intense tillage, that's a 76% decrease in weed biomass. For a herbicide to be registered, there has to be 80% reduction. So just with those two together, you're getting something that is fairly close to herbicide application. The HW on the far right is hand weeding. That's more of a small plot thing. Just if you're wondering though, very effective, but maybe not effective out in the field. So there are some products that have been available. These ones are ones that clip the seeds or the weeds above the crop canopy. This could be useful for something like lentils if you have a weed that's taller than the lentils. There will be a bit of injury from the wheels of that pass, but it's something you can use to prevent some of those seeds. Again, taller weeds, shorter crop. So maybe wild oats, wild mustard, or Canada thistle. For candidates, probably wild buckwheat, cleavers, and kochia. Wild buckwheat usually will go twining up a plant, but if it doesn't have much go up on, it will kind of spread out and trail as well. So if it's something that's just along the ground, it's obviously you can't get to that with this type of equipment. Um, Also, the great resistance spreader. Spreading residue is very important to get it even, but you can also be spreading a lot of weed seeds in there as well. If possible, if you have a weedy field or or you have some resistance issues or even some fairly bad weed issues, if possible, you could go to, or farmers could go to that field last. Also, especially when it's dry out, kind of maybe even blowing off as much as kind of the dust and stuff you can get off will help reduce it if you can do that between fields. So we'll talk about harvest weed seed management. So there are chaff decks. So these are kind of off the side, and they'll collect chaff from the sieves and put it in wheel tracks of the combine. And if you have controlled traffic farming, where you're farming on, for example, 30-foot spacing or consistent spacing, where you're running that over repeatedly, that'll kind of have some compaction to kind of get those to be trampled, and also to have just your competition on those lines. This has also been used by some producers in Australia where they just spray where those chaff decks are putting down chaff and weeds to reduce their herbicide costs as well. There's also you can grind or have a hammer mill. So for this, the residue does go back in the field. It can have over 95% control of weeds that go into the combine. And this is like the seed terminator or the Harrington seed destructor. Weed hog by Tuck Farm, and there's also a seed control unit from Redicop, and this one is made in Saskatchewan. And for these, basically, there's something that goes in there, like a hammer mill or something like that, that'll kind of basically beat up the seeds until they're not viable. So this is some of Brianne Tideman's research. If you're looking at the ones on the left, that is the chaff that's coming straight out of a combine. And on the right, this is what has gone through a mill. So definitely you can see it's kind of broken up a fair bit. If you're looking at plants, this is on the left. There's no harvested weed control. And on the right, there is harvested weed control. And that's 10,000 canola seeds. So as a visual, there's definitely a lot of reduction in there. Some of the limitations, again, not perfect for all weeds. For wild oats, they'll have about 60% of their seed on average. So maybe controlling 50 or 60%, but that is another way to control some of the population with another practice as well. And this is a high initial investment, cost-wise, and also somewhat in horsepower. But going forward, if you have more herbicide-resistant weeds, how much are those herbicides going to cost you, and how much do you have to change production because of that? And survey results had shown that there was an additional $1.40 in fuel cost per acre. This was from some producers, I believe, in Alberta. Their estimation was to get kind of the cost back within 5 or more years, what they were thinking. And there is, I believe, 40 to 45 mills currently running on farms in Western Canada. So there are people that have been using them and finding some success. You could also, for example, if you or if there's an operation with multiple combines, Maybe you could have one where you're going through on your weedy patches, or you could save one of them for weedier areas in the field. So that might be an option instead of having everything changed over. So if we're looking at seed retention data, this again is species specific um, and dependent on the environment of the year and the cropping system. But this shows, for example, you want the seed retention up. So the top line's canola because you need that seed to be retained so you can harvest it. If you're looking at wild oats, they'll sometimes shatter. So it depends on when you're combining. If it's maybe our area a bit earlier on, you may be getting more of that seed versus later on, a lot of it may have already shattered. So move into cultural control. So looking at sanitation, and this kind of goes along with cleaning off combines or blowing off chaff and weed. This is kind of your easiest, cheapest, and best weed control, and it's similar for diseases as well. Is to not let that weed species or resistant biotype establish in the first place. So starting with clean seed, clean to federal standards, cleaning off route seeding and harvest equipment, and field boundaries and non-cropped areas, especially where there's salinity, are kind of nurseries for resistance, especially when you have lower than recommended rates of herbicides or sublethal doses, where you're controlling some of it, but it's at a bit of a rate where you're not getting complete kill, or and that can, because only the resistant plants are surviving, they can cross and kind of increase that population. I believe Steve Shirtliff has said to control your kochia nurseries, so especially in those saline areas. And odds are you're probably not getting a lot of production in those areas anyway. So if it's something you could put into a perennial forage or an annual crop, like maybe a barley or something in there that's competitive, that will still reduce the production of those weed seeds. This one's looking at seeding rate and row spacing. So on the left, there's half of the seeding rate. Canola was put in there as the weed, and 16-inch row spacing. If you look on the right, 2 times seeding rate and 12-inch row spacing. So there's definitely a difference there. You can fairly easily see the canola or the weeds on the left versus a lot less on the right. And this is weed management again versus seeding rate. So even if you have a very uncompetitive crop, like lentils, they can more effectively compete with weeds when you increase your seeding rate. So normally your goal for establishment is 130 plants per square meter. For organic production, it's 230 plants per square meter. What they did here is they looked at 130. So the top one biomass is for the crop. The bottom one is the biomass for the weeds. And this one's even kind of gone past that 230. A lot of the times in research, you're kind of looking for maybe suboptimal to kind of almost extremes too. So this may be why it's this high. But you definitely are increasing the biomass of that crop and decreasing the biomass of the weed. This is Charles Geddes' research. He was looking at layering cultural and chemical weed management. So in this case, row spacing and seeding rate. The top was 18-inch rows with either 200 or 100 seeds per square meter, or 130 for lentils. And that's even just visually comparing with the bottom. That's 9-inch row spacing, so row spacing that's kind of double what it is on the top. And the weed seed, or sorry, not the weed, the crop seeding rate has been doubled from the top versus the bottom. And even in the lentils, which is not competitive, you can see a fairly big difference. So for this one, reducing row spacing and increasing seeding rate, The densities were reduced by 59%, the biomass by 80%, so that is kind of similar to a herbicide application. And then the seed bank was reduced by 63%. You can also look at crop rotation diversity. So in the top, you can see they went spring wheat canola, spring wheat lentils. There's also alfalfa and meadow brome in some cases versus winter wheat canola, winter wheat lentils. So just changing from a spring crop to a winter one. So with that winter wheat, the density was reduced by 60%, the biomass by 72%, and the seed bank by 51%. I'm not too sure why the seed bank was increased with that perennial in rotation. Yeah, sometimes it's a bit odd, but I would expect maybe it was the first year where it wasn't as competitive or established, so that might be why there is an increase, but it would definitely, once it is established, be more competitive and over the long term should reduce that weeds in the seed bank. For fertilizer placement, if you're broadcasting fertilizer, that means the weeds and the crops have equal access to that fertilizer. Maybe even in some cases, for deeper seeded crops, if the seeds are further up, they may even have increased access. So if you target the fertilizer to give the crop the best advantage, so that would be seed placed or side band, that will definitely can get the crop going and being more competitive versus the weeds. And nitrification inhibitors as well has increased the amount of granular fertilizer broadcasting. Definitely a useful tool. That's something to keep in mind. For fertilizer placement, there's a study at Lethbridge looking at the impact of placement on weeds, including wild oat, lamb quarters, green foxtail, and wild mustard. And depending on the species, the seed bank at the end of the 4-year study was reduced by a quarter to 63% with point injection. So with injected into the ground with broadcast nitrogen. And also even just for fertilizer effectiveness, it's more effective to put fertilizer into the ground compared to broadcast. Wild oat and green foxtail can use nitrogen more efficiently than wheat, so if you are giving them equal access to, they might be out competing or getting a jump on your crop. And if you're looking at fertilizing in the spring instead of fall, is useful for reducing the impact of wild oat and wild mustard. If you're fertilizing in the fall, that fertilizer will be there the first thing in the spring. So if those weeds are germinating then, they may get a bit of a start compared to when your crop comes up. Whereas if you're fertilizing in the spring, you're fertilizing usually right before or with seeding. So that timing is more effective for the crop too. And again, soil test and provide the crop the balance of nutrients it needs. And in some years, if you have better than expected yields, which is great, you may also have removed more phosphorus. So phosphorus is kind of needed to get crops up and going. So to make sure that's replaced if necessary. If you want to do a crop rotation as well as herbicide rotation, it should be planned well in advance. If you can do 4 or more years, that would be great. Mixing competitive and non-competitive crops like grasses, broadleaves, and legumes is very helpful. And if you can, periodic perennial forages. It doesn't always isn't always a great option for people that don't have livestock or if you don't have livestock nearby. So that's why kind of if you can, it's good. If you can't, that's understandable for sure. And including cover crops or intercrops where compatible. Intercrops will kind of break up a bit of the weeds life cycle because you have a couple different things going on. Cover crops, if you're looking at something, you could maybe do something, if possible, in the spring and the fall. We are up in Western Canada, so that we can't necessarily do what they could do in the States. We're having kind of shoulder crops or something growing in the spring or the fall. So when you can, it's a good practice to help compete with those weeds. If you can put a forage into rotation, that can be fairly effective. For this study, they're looking at having alfalfa or alfalfa grass hay for over 3 years. Decrease the number of weeds, but it also can sometimes, because you're shifting that life cycle, um, well, it's being more effective for reduction in weeds for those ones. Sometimes it can kind of be better for different weeds just with that production shift. So to increase competition, start with clean fields. Calculate your seeding rate using 1,000 seed weight. Sask canola, Sask oil seeds, and Canola Council quite a while ago did a study where they're looking at if you just seeded at like five bushels an acre, or sorry, 5 pounds per acre. If you had some fairly large seeds, the spacing between those can be fairly significant compared to smaller seeds. So if you're using 1,000 seed weight, it can kind of space that out more evenly and have the crop be more competitive. Decreasing your row spacing and avoiding chem fallow. Chem fallow, basically there's no competition for anything there at all. So avoid it if you can. In some cases, if some weed pressure gets really, really bad, it might be the best option to look after that problem for the short term, but avoid it when you can. Choose more competitive crops. Barley is similar to canola, which is more competitive than wheat. Then there's flax in order from most to least, then soybean, and then other pulse crops are at the bottom. So I guess in summary, minimize risk or resistance. If you can reduce those weed densities before herbicides are used, there's a lot of tools that you can use, and using a lot of tools is better than using one tool for weed management. That'll also increase how long your herbicides can be effective. And also, if there's a competition in there, your herbicides will also be more effective with those other practices. Include short and long-term goals. Some culture methods are as good or better than herbicides for reducing those weed densities. And know what's in your field, kind of what weed types there, what patterns are they. Is there herbicide resistance? You can only manage what you know is there, so it's best to find out. Herbicide history is important, and for this, as well as many other things, having really good records is key and will help you out for sure. And there's lots of great resources out there, and there's lots of people to help. So I want to thank our provincial weed specialist, Corey Jacob, as well as our extension agrologist intern, Jap, for helping me put this information together. And there's their contact information I'll leave up there for just a sec. And then also there's my contact information there. So thanks.
Very good. Thank you so much, Shannon, for that. I would like to open the floor for questions if there are, and I'll also direct your attention to the chat box. There is Lori put up the website for prairie weeds as well if you are interested in that. So, are there any questions for Shannon?